Kalshi. Kalshi seems to be the topic of conversation these days, mostly because I think people are just sort of morally disgusted and outraged at the idea of somebody betting on a presidential election. But as someone who was nerdy about the concept of prediction markets before they became like a well-known, well-established thing, I feel like you're ignoring the pros of this new thing called Kalshi, okay? Prediction markets, here's the pitch, here's the concept. Normally, people have all these ingrained subconscious biases in their worldview that guide their decision making, and day to day, they can continue believing these obviously, transparently false things, and usually they can just ignore the consequences or the outcomes. They could believe false things and ignore it when results do not go as you would expect based on your theory. So they can predict, for example, the outcome of a presidential election, maybe based on which candidate they would prefer has the best chances of winning, or maybe based on some false piece of political insight that they're really sure about. And then when the event actually comes to pass and it turns out they're wrong, they can continue not examining those biases that caused them to make that false prediction. The concept of a prediction market, the purpose of it, from my perspective, is it is a heuristic device. It's a way of getting closer to truth. It's a way of getting closer to knowledge. So you place a bet, it turns out that you're wrong, and now obviously you have an immediate financial incentive now to figure out why you were wrong so that you don't lose money anymore. Now, instead of just being able to be wrong without any consequences, you're actually putting money on the line, and because of that, I think people are going to start examining their biases a little bit more seriously if they engage with these types of platforms. Because if you want to make money, you have to be free of biases and subconscious beliefs that could lead you to false outcomes. Additionally, there is evidence that prediction markets work better than any kind of polling data. Like Nate Silver, it's been shown that prediction markets are more effective than Nate Silver's polling data. Now, in my opinion, that's not saying much, because polling data is a pseudoscience. It's nonsense, right? But if you're believing in polling data, but prediction markets are absurd to you, then I feel like you've got a subconscious bias functioning there. I feel like you've got a sort of a stigma attached. Oh, you like this pseudoscience better than this other pseudoscience. I wonder why. The response to this has also been weird, because I think it's largely liberals that are responding so negatively to this Kalshi stuff, right? And I don't get the impression that the left of today is super critical of gambling, other than in this one specific instance. You know, I've talked to people about gambling in the past, and about wanting to stricten gambling regulation, and about wanting the state to step in and do more about preventing these industries from taking advantage of people, from taking advantage of elderly people. You go to these bingo halls, right? And they have these machines now, which are, in theory, designed to make bingo more accessible. In theory, they allow people who are going blind, and, you know, a lot of their customers are older, so that makes sense, to use these machines to punch their bingo cards for them automatically so that they don't have to punch them themselves. But in practice, it allows them to gamble at exponential scales prior to what they were doing before. Because prior to what they were doing, you know, now, they have a dozen cards in front of them, and they have to real quick. And so your ability to stamp them real quick was a kind of a skill, and that was necessary to play multiple cards. But now, you can just buy 1,000 cards across 10 different machines and sit there and watch your bets play out with no active participation. Because the game, for a real gambler, a hard gambling addict, the game portion is the least important part of the process. They're trying to strip away as much human agency, as much thought, as much control out of the system as is humanly possible to maximize the risk-reward mechanism. They're trying to gamble as much as possible and play a game as little as possible. And no one cares. No one cares if the state liberalizes gambling. No one cares if children are buying those little eggs that are basically gambling for kids, where they don't know whether they're going to get a rare prize or a common prize, and they spend 10 hours a day on their iPads watching other people buy them and just sitting there thinking about the day that they'll be able to afford to buy them, and then they make their parents buy as many as they could squeeze out of them, and then they're probably disappointed. Right? They probably come home and get a bunch of common ones and then never even play with them because it wasn't even about the play. It wasn't about the toy. It was about the gambling addiction. We're giving our children and our elderly population gambling addictions. And I'm the only one who seems to care. But then suddenly a new thing comes out that involves an element of gambling, but also actually has a positive use value. Of potentially being good for predicting outcomes, of potentially being a good way to get closer to arriving at truth about significant real-world events, of potentially breaking down people's biases and falsehoods, right? We finally have a version of gambling that has something of value to offer society, and this is the only gambling you think is bad? Ah!